So for some of you, here's a little bit of background. White Slough is part of the National Wildlife Refuge down in South Bay. The goal was to restore 41 acres of tidal wetland habitats from subsided fallow fields. This was accomplished by approximately depositing about 240,000 cubic yards of sediment fill to raise it up to an elevation that could support vegetation. There's a lot of partners in this project, probably many of them in the room, a lot of funders. One thing to note is that some of this funding did come through the state for greenhouse gas mitigation projects. And so one of the important questions was, yes, we're going to provide ecosystem restoration and improve habitat and estuary water quality. We also want to know if it can help mitigate greenhouse gases being produced in California. So our governor wants us to be carbon neutral in the next decade or so. And in doing so, the voters of California supported funding to do nature-based mitigation. So we want to reduce emissions, but we also want to restore habitats because plants take in carbon dioxide, which we pollute, and store it in the plants themselves or in the soils. So wetlands are an important component, even though in acreage-wise in California, it's not terribly a lot. But wetlands, as they store that carbon underground, it gets locked away for hundreds or thousands of years. Whereas in a forest, there might be more carbon sequestration opportunity, but then a fire could come through and release it all back out into the atmosphere. So there's these trade-offs, and unfortunately, we all know a lot about wildfires these days. So here's a schematic of the original design. Again, Connor can probably explain this better, but the design itself had a variety of cells, primarily because they were breached at different times, but it was it is a mosaic of tidal wetland habitat, brackish habitat, and uplands. The motivation for the project was that the levees were failing. You can see the photos there. Sea level rise will continue to sort of eat away at these old levees, and that the opportunity to gain wetland habitat. So the timeline, I really simplified it here, but it's more complicated than this. But there was a, quote, accidental breach around 2014 with a culvert failure that introduced tidal waters into a part of the property. Then in 2018 and 19, they breached different cells, and then 2021 was the final breaching of the site. So it's now fully tidal, and the design and implementation is done. And the USGS was brought in 2021 to do some monitoring of the site. So here's a picture I borrowed from the US Fish and Wildlife Service. So everybody loves these pictures. That means you made the finish line, right? Okay, so what were our monitoring questions? The first one was, how is site topography changing? So that is being done with drone surveys. That's being led by Jenny Curtis. Many of you may know her from the USGS. What is the accretion and elevation change in the restoration? So there's two general assumptions with restorations, that the accretion and elevation change will increase. So after you bring tidal waters in, sediment will deposit and it will build a marsh, right? Build it and they will come. We know now, because of sea level rise and all kinds of things, we don't know that's like the best case scenario, right? Or there will be very little because it's been filled and it's already at like a suitable elevation. We have been monitoring that with surface elevation tables and marker horizons, and I'll describe what those are if you're not familiar with it. Then because of the carbon funding that helped this project, what are the carbon stocks in the reference marsh sites, and how does that compare to White Slough? So they would like to know how much carbon sequestration occurred in these restorations. And so this White Slough project is one of many, many throughout the state of California. And so I do have the opportunity to be monitoring a few more of those. We know that for those of us that are practitioners in the room, that as soon as you're done with the restoration project, it's not fully a wetland usually, right? It takes time. Connor just mentioned they had projected 40 years for the restoration he was showing. So what the state needs, and those of us that are interested in sort of mitigating for climate change, is how much carbon can these store, right? And so the only way we really know is to measure it. So when I was approached and said, can you tell us how much carbon our restoration achieved so we can tell the state? I said, no, because you won't see any in about 3 years, maybe a little. And so what we proposed, I said, okay, how about we measure the different marshes around San Francisco, sorry, that's where I am. Humboldt Bay, that's like the biggest taboo, right? Humboldt Bay. So if we measure the different ones around Humboldt Bay, we can then say, okay, if you start restoring and you end up with this type of marsh in the end, this is how much carbon should be in it. Because you already have carbon in your wetlands here. So you can start adding, okay, well, if we add 10 acres, we're gonna get this much carbon. And the reason that that is important, besides we just wanna slow down climate change, is that there is a carbon market being stood up in California where they are paying people to restore wetlands. The hardest part about restoration is coming up with all that money. And there is a very big funding stream coming down the pipe. So the very first carbon funded restoration on private property just occurred in the San Francisco Bay Delta. They paid a farmer to restore his agriculture lands. So instead of growing rice, he's now growing a wetland. So growing a wetland. Yeah, so birds love it, fish love it. We can slow down warming. So there's a lot of things on the horizon. So the better you kind of are prepared for it coming, the more you can leverage that opportunity. Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, but that's why there's carbon questions on here. And how does the total organic carbon change over time in the wetland restoration? So we did soil coring, vegetation surveys. I'm going to primarily focus on these two today just because of the length of the talk. I will touch on carbon briefly at the end. Now that I just talked it up, and you guys don't get to hear any results. Okay, so quickly, Jenny Curtis led the drone survey questions. She partnered with a local company. And anyway, it's really cool, high resolution data. So here's some photos of that. So 2020 was before the breaching, and 2023 was the most recent picture that had been taken. So you can sort of see that design that came into fruition. There's different cells. We have the interior ponds, which are kind of brackish ponding habitats. Okay, so then she sent me this slide, and I said, what does this mean, Jenny? And what she was seeing in the imagery and doing a spatial analysis was that, there was kind of creek formation and erosion. So good. We want restorations to kind of naturally form. But then she was also seeing some of these features, which she hypothesized as lateral spreading of the area because of the earthquakes. Well, I don't have to tell you guys, but you guys had a big earthquake in December of 2022 and actually one the following year. So I said, okay, that's neat. But okay, I don't know what to do with that yet. So, and here's some more analysis on areas of blue or deposition. So increasing of elevation. Some of that is just vegetation colonization, which is great. Red is erosion. So we expect that, right? We bring in water to a system, it's gonna fine tune its topography. So there's a lot of information here, but all of this will be available in a report and raw data. So we have erosion and deposition kind of occurring at the system. Okay, so then I started looking at this data to present today. So what is the accretion and elevation change in the restoration? So like I mentioned, they had used fill to bring this restoration elevation up to suitable for vegetation. So the hope was that vegetation would kind of recolonize this area. So to do that, we installed surface elevation tables. You can see the pictures of those. They are long-term monitoring plots. They're used all over the country and the world. It's a very standardized approach, which is good to have, because when people are looking for this type of data, you have some here that you can provide. And it's all comparable in Humboldt Bay, in Chesapeake Bay. Like it's all collected the same way. So we get two types of data from that total elevation change. So we basically drill steel rods into the earth and get about as stable of a benchmark as you can get in Humboldt Bay. But because we're the USGS, we survey it in every single time I read it, because, you know, we like to do that. And then you pair it with feldspar, which are marker horizons, and that's the white stuff you see. That's a natural clay material. You can buy it at pottery shops and plant stores. And so we can say what's depositing on the surface and how's the total elevation changing in the whole kind of soil column. So we installed 12 of those, and we've read them 7 times since 2020. So here, this is where they're located. We tried to place them in different cells and along a transect, some near the water, and then going up into the upland, so there's a bit of an elevation gradient. Okay, and then we made this graph, and I said, oh my gosh, this is messy. And I'm sorry to end the Friday afternoon with messy data and graphs. So what we would have wanted to see is either flat lines or, you know, going up lines. But we saw this across all of them. So our next hypothesis, I said, well, Jenny sent me that slide about earthquakes. Let's figure out where they are in this plot. So these gray lines are the 2 earthquakes that occurred here in December of 2022, and I think 21 too, right? And I think we're seeing the land move. So that, you know, you don't really put that into your monitoring plan of like having to restart time 0 multiple times. And I actually am surprised I'm the first one to mention earthquakes today. I mean, this is Humboldt. Usually people bring it up. So that's the total elevation change. Okay, so each one of those points is a set location. It went down after the first earthquake. It then sort of what I would consider restabilized, went back up to 0 is like the starting point, right? So 0 was like the initial elevation. So it kind of went back to where it was. And then it was starting to increase, as you would hope. And then you guys had another earthquake and it went way down. And then it tried to get back up to 0. So there's lots of movement in this data. So this is the accretion, right? So this is what's being deposited on the marsh surface. So during this time, the marsh accretion was either 0 or a few millimeters. So kind of what you would expect, right? The tide brings sediment in, deposits it, and the tide leaves. So when you put it together, we have total elevation going down, but an accretion still happening. So it's still getting flooding and depositing, but the whole site went down with the earthquake. So like the way wetlands work is that the lower you are, the higher accretion you have, because that wetland is trying to keep up with water levels. It is super confusing, trust me. I stared at this for like the last week and I kept adding slides. So it's like, let's try to figure this out. Okay, so I added an earthquake slide last night and I said, let's look at the survey data. Did this stuff really move? And yes, it did, all of them. So this set, so each one of those kind of lines is a different set table at White Slough. They both experience vertical and horizontal shifting following the earthquakes, which impacts how much they're flooded, the sediment accretion, just kind of the total elevation in the tide. So you can see that, and down at the bottom is the mean. So easting and northings moved anywhere from 3 centimeters to 29. Like, that's a lot. And then elevation-wise, the mean is they went down about 5 centimeters. That's a lot. So, and on the picture on the graph is the USGS report of the earthquake like directionality. And this site is in South Bay, and it looked like it was going every direction. So I'm not quite sure what to do with this yet in my brain or what it means for the restoration, but just keep it in mind as you visit your sites around the bay and look at other things. Like if you see something, it looks a little different, investigate this. Maybe your wetland site went down, maybe it went up, maybe it shifted right or left, because all of that happened at White Slough. Sorry. So this data just sort of supports the rest of it. This is the rate of change for all of them, and you can see all of the set tables had negative elevation change over the time of monitoring. Is that because of the restoration itself or an earthquake? I will tell you in about 6 months. But accretion was occurring. A lot of them had 0. Most of the accretion occurred on the number 1s, which was the ocean side. So that's kind of as expected. They get the tides first, they get the most sediment. So you can see it was decreasing, but some of those locations were trying to keep up. So I originally had the fill slide because I thought, oh, the messy data is the fill, and it may be. So as Connor mentioned, it's really hard to get clean fill for restorations when you want to raise an elevation. And because of that, they had to put in fill over many years from different locations. And so we're going to look at, the type of fill, how much did it matter? So you can see that, as Connor mentioned, it had very different kind of makeup. So here we took photo points at all of our locations during every reading. And the ones on the left are closest to the bay, and the ones on the right are upland. And you can see that most of them have not vegetated yet after this amount of time. Only the ones in the middle there's 3 of them that had increased in elevation. But then we had 4 of them with accretion, but not increases in elevation. So there was only 1 set table that had an increase in elevation and accretion, which is what marshes should be doing. Right? You have accretion on top and your elevation increases. So nothing is as predicted. So quickly about carbon stocks. This is I promise I'm going to be fast. We did core 7 reference marshes around Humboldt Bay, including White Slough restoration and 2 land uses. So kind of like preconditioned agriculture, pasture land. And we are processing those. This is where we cored. Thank God for that huge screen, right? You can actually maybe see it. So we tried to spread around the bay. We didn't get everywhere, but I think it's a good snapshot. And this is the only result I have, which is for bulk density. So each one of these lines is a different marsh. And we had 1 fallow field, which is in the red box, and which is an area slated for hopeful restoration someday. And then 2 restoration sites. Okay, this is a bulk density value. Bulk density is the mass of like the dry soil, like how compact is it. So organic soils have lower bulk density. So the lower the numbers, the more organic. So mineral dominated marshes tend to fall within 0.5 and 1.5, and that's where yours fall, which is not a surprise if you're familiar with the estuary. But we then can use this information once we're done with the rest of it, and we'll have what total carbon, right? And then you scale it by the acres. So this is kind of more to come. So in conclusion, our monitoring ends this year in 2024. The final report and the data will be available in 2025. Given the slow vegetation recovery, I think continued monitoring is recommended, especially with the earthquakes. Just kind of shifting things around. We're not really quite sure what's going to happen next. Earthquakes may have changed the topography. I think I've talked about that a lot.